if you're a lender, there's an easy recipe for maximizing your fake accounting income if you're a lender. And it goes like this. 4 ingredients. 1, grow like crazy. 2, by making really, really crappy loans, but at a premium yield. Yield just means interest rate. 3, while employing extreme leverage. And 4, while setting aside only the most trivial reserves, allowances for the inevitable losses that this kind of behavior produces. So George Akerlof and Paul Romer wrote the classic article in Economics about this in 1993, and their title really says it all in terms of the dynamic. It's Looting the Economic Underworld of Bankruptcy for Profit. So again, the idea is you have a seemingly legitimate entity. The person at the top is looting it. They loot it by destroying it, but they walk away wealthy. Of course, in the modern era, we may bail out the entity, so it may not even fail in that sense. But here's what Akerlof and Romer also said that was so critical as an understanding. They said these 4 steps, these 4 ingredients, it's just math. It is, and I'm quoting them now, a sure thing. So you're mathematically guaranteed, if you do these 4 things, to report not just substantial income, but record levels of income. And that's when Akerlof and Romer said, now that's the next thing that comes in that's really important, and that is modern executive and modern professional compensation. Because with modern compensation, first at the executive level, the CEO level, I can guarantee with modern executive compensation that if I follow this recipe, I will personally be wealthy almost immediately as the CEO. Because I'll base my compensation as CEO, and that's the nice thing about being CEO, you get to make the rules for yourself. You'll base it on short-term reported income, and you'll make that compensation extremely large for supposed superlative results. In jargon in the industry, stretch goals.
Yes.
So you're going to say, hey, if I double my income in just a few years, which is what the Fannie Mae goal was,
yep,
then I get an off-the-charts bonus. Huge compensation. Except that, of course, that goal is easy to meet. You just have to cheat. It is a sure thing.
Now, Bill, is it possible to follow this 4-step prescription and remain within the letter of the law?
It is in places that it may be. This is a question right now that's up for grabs. In places where international accounting rules apply. Because under international accounting rules, they're being interpreted by many folks as saying you are not permitted as a lending institution to establish any meaningful allowances for losses, loan losses now, even though it is absolutely certain that making, remember the ingredient is the first 2, grow extremely rapidly by making really, really awful loans at a premium yield. Well, that's guaranteed to produce massive losses down the road. The international accounting rules, many people are interpreting as you are not permitted to establish in reserves. So that could create the perfect crime.
So what happens when, say, your supposed third-party auditing company comes in and performs their yearly due diligence audit and then signs off on the financial statements of this company and says, these have all been fairly represented and the risks have all been adequately explained and we think this company is fairly representing itself, and then, surprise, surprise, like Lucy pulling the football away. I mean, we always seem to be surprised when it turns out there are glaring, overt, gross material misrepresentations of risk, of assets, of liabilities, of all kinds of things, and somehow that happens again and again and again. I'm really interested where the letter of the law is on this. Is there no responsibility here?
Well, the letter of the law in the United States, under generally accepted accounting principles, is that you have to establish the loss reserves now if you make large losses inevitable in the future. So, and that if you actually establish the appropriate loss reserves, of course, you would show under this recipe that you were losing money, not making money, and you wouldn't get any bonus. So under the letter of the law, there's a fraud in the United States. It turns out there are many frauds in Europe as well because people get greedier. Now, let me approach your more basic question. And your more basic question really has two areas, and that is, so again, why are these control frauds unique? Why are they much more dangerous than regular frauds? And what is this thing that I alluded to, and that is professional compensation. So that'll bring in your question about the auditor. Mm-hmm. But if we back up, what's special when you have a seemingly legitimate entity and the person at the top of the food chain is the crook? The joke that actually many cultures have, like China, is, of course, that fish rot from the head. Mm-hmm. And that's designed to capture precisely this point. Well, so the big things about the seemingly legitimate enemy when the CEO is the crook. First, everybody reports to the CEO, ultimately. Mm-hmm. Right? So the CEO is the point failure mechanism where if he or she goes bad, almost everything may go bad as well. So all those things that we call controls, internal and external controls, all report to the CEO, and the CEO therefore can, as I'll describe, use compensation, hiring, firing, praise, and such to produce the environment that will create allies for his fraud. Now note that what I'm saying, the CEO, the art of this is not to defeat your controls. The art, the elegant solution, as in mathematics, is to suborn the controls and turn them into your most valuable allies. And therefore, for example, when you are running an accounting control fraud, where your weapon of fraud is accounting, and that weapon of choice in finance is accounting, you're going to want to hire the most prestigious accountants as your outside auditors, because it is precisely their reputation that is most valuable when you can suborn them, and they give you that clean opinion that you just described that will help you deceive other shareholders. So one enormous advantage is internal and external controls come to the CEO level. A second incredible advantage is the CEO can optimize the firm as a weapon of fraud. And the CEO can do that. Basically, this falls into two big categories. One, you can put it in assets that have no readily verifiable market value. Mm-hmm. Because then it's a lot easier to inflate asset valuations and to hide real losses. Yeah. And the second thing you do is grow like crazy. And of course, that is the essence of something your listeners have all heard about, and that is a Ponzi scheme. And so these accounting control frauds have strong Ponzi scheme-like elements, which is why they tend to cause such catastrophic losses.
human nature does not change, and it's always human nature to try and game the system, get an advantage, have a free lunch, however we want to put that. And so we're sophisticated enough that we've seen these happen often enough that we know what the dynamic is. You've just mentioned this paper by these two gentlemen where there's 4 steps. We know what these all are. It is my view that we had tighter regulatory structures that were around the concept of saying, listen, these things are going to happen. We're going to put a basket around this as best we can, and then do what we need to do in order to assure that these things do not flourish. Maybe we'll have prosecutions. So fast forward, I'm looking at a chart here. It shows federal prosecutions for financial fraud are at an all-time low, and my personal perception is that the amount of fraud is probably at an all-time high. They seem potentially correlated, those two pieces of data. Is that true, and how did we get here?
Well, you have really interesting phraseology. You talked about we know, and you talked about we're more sophisticated. So this was an important part of what Akerlof and Romer were talking about in that paper. They chose to conclude the following paragraph, which I'll get approximately right from memory. And to make it their last paragraph for emphasis, they said, look, in the savings and loan crisis, economists and the public had no theory of this kind of fraud, control fraud. And as a result, they were not in a position to give strong support to the examiners in the field, the regulators, banking regulators, actually savings and loan regulators in the field, who recognized from the beginning that this kind of deregulation was bound to create widespread fraud. Now we know better. If we take advantage of this knowledge, we need not repeat this kind of crisis. That's written in 1993.
Right.
And what happened, of course, is right around the same time, we did get allegedly more sophisticated in a small part of we. And that small part of we dominated and continues to largely dominate policy. And that small portion of we had exactly the opposite conclusion on the basis of this alleged sophistication. And they said, and this is Easterbrook and Fischel. No, so your listeners need to know that George Akerlof goes on to win the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001. So we've been talking about one of the most prominent economists in the world. But in the law and economics world, a generation of American lawyers has been taught when they study the economics of corporations by a treatise written in 1991 by Judge Easterbrook of the Seventh Circuit and Fischel, who was then a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, eventually the dean of the University of Chicago Law School. And Easterbrook and Fischel, and again I'll get this virtually word for word, say famously, a rule against fraud is not essential or even particularly important in the securities context. Now, notice how radical a statement that is. It isn't that we don't need laws, that we don't need prosecutors, that we don't need FBI agents, U.S. attorneys, those kind of folks. We don't even need a rule against fraud. We don't need the ability to bring civil suits. We don't need the Securities and Exchange Commission. Securities markets are so efficient that they automatically exclude any meaningful accounting control fraud. And we know that they're efficient because we've hypothesized they're efficient. In the wonderful circularity. This was, of course, the efficient market hypothesis that was the centerpiece of all of modern finance theory. And even the weakest version of the efficient market hypothesis requires that there be no systematic errors in pricing. Because if there's any systematic error in pricing, well, then somebody would correct it. They would make money by correcting it. And therefore, financial bubbles are impossible as well. Fraud's impossible. Now, all of this is insane. And indeed, Fischel was the outside expert for three of the most notorious accounting control frauds of the savings and loan debacle era. Lincoln Savings, Michael Milken at Drexel Burnham Lambert, and this incredibly sleazy Florida one as well, where the headquarters building was shown in Miami Vice for people who are old enough to know that.
Yep.
And then after he tried his theories in the real world and ended up praising the worst fraud in America, Charles Keating's Lincoln Savings, as the best savings and loan in America, he wrote those words that I've just quoted without ever telling the reader, hey, by the way, I tried this in the real world, and it was the most embarrassing disaster conceivable. So there's a strong element of intellectual dishonesty as well that went along with all of this. Anyway, if you believe that fraud's impossible in the financial sphere, if you believe that markets are inherently efficient and self-correcting, then there's a clear answer about what you should do about regulation. Financial regulation. Financial regulation, A, is unnecessary, and B, is potentially very harmful because it will potentially stop or interfere at least with the self-correcting, efficient nature of the marketplace. And therefore, you must be lead a jihad against regulation if you want the country to prosper. And that's precisely what these folks did. Well, okay, now that's academics. And yeah, they've trained a generation of lawyers who are now out there in key positions in business and regulation. But surely no one, the adults, right, can't believe this. But in fact, they did, and in particular, Alan Greenspan had this view. So he famously, in his first person-to-person meeting with Brooksley Bourne, then the new chair of the Commodities Future Trading Commission, invites her over to meet her and says, in the course of the lunch, but of course we're going to disagree about things. Now, they've never had a substantive discussion like this, and Brooksley's wondering, what? And he follows up and says, because you, for example, believe that fraud provides a basis for regulation, preventing fraud. Now, that's how extreme, and that was, unfortunately, of course, the most powerful financial regulatory position in the world was held by someone who believed, former Ayn Rand devotee, this insanity. But it gets worse, because Greenspan was also involved, hired by Charles Keating. In fact, Charles Keating hired Greenspan in multiple capacities, and one of those capacities was as lobbyist, to walk the floors of the Senate to recruit the 5 senators who would become known as the Keating Five when 25 years ago, on April 9th, 1987, they intervened on Keating's behalf, those 5 senators, secretly, to try to get us not to take enforcement action against Lincoln Savings. Keating also famously put in writing to our agency that Lincoln Savings should be allowed to do hundreds of millions of dollars of these direct investments, which is what we denied them permission to do, and they did anyway. That was a violation of rules that the senators were trying to immunize by their political pressure. Mm-hmm. Well, Greenspan opined in writing that we should allow it because, and I'm quoting again, Lincoln Savings poses no foreseeable risk of loss. Gosh, he almost got that exactly right, except for the fact that it was the most expensive failure of the entire debacle at $3.4 billion, which, as you say, now sounds quaint, but back in the day used to be considered a substantial amount of money. If you believe that fraud is possible, then derivatives are a potential problem. If you believe that fraud is impossible, and that these people are sophisticated, remember your sophistication illusion again?
Yeah.
Then it is unambiguous with neoclassical economic theory that the greater the choices, the better the results. Because people will only make good choices for themselves. And as a result, by definition, the purchaser of the derivative will be the one who finds it most valuable. And since asset valuation and risk are inversely related, it will be the entity that perceives holding that derivative as least risky. In other words, you will get derivatives held by the ideal people for whom they're in idiosyncratic conditions that reduce the risk of holding that derivative for them. And so you will optimize throughout the entire financial system the placement of risk in the ideal fashion with the people best situated to have that risk. And not only you have that advantage, but on top of that, it means you will broadly diversify the risks such that there is very little concentration of risk, and therefore your entire financial system will systemically be far less risky. So though they knew all of those things, as soon as they started with the assumption that there couldn't be any frauds.
Well, if you're going to rest that on the efficient market hypothesis, there is one other little assumption baked into that, which is that we have even flows of information. There are no information asymmetries. And the very definition of fraud is that it has an asymmetry of information. I can't square that circle either. There's an intellectual hole in what you're describing that's just gigantic.
Well, enough to drive the world's largest financial bubble through. We had whole areas, liar's loans, where the fraud incidence, when the people measured it, was 90%, 90. Wow. And we had whole areas like collateralized debt obligations, in which the most typical CDO, collateralized debt obligation, was backed overwhelmingly by fraudulent liar's loans.
And we knew about this at the time. There was open articles about ninja loans, and this was a very open secret.
The defining element about what makes something a liar's loan is that you don't do adequate underwriting. Underwriting is the process of evaluating whether you're going to get repaid when you make a loan, and what are the risks of it, so that you can price, decide whether you should make the loan, on what conditions, and at what price you should do that. And because when you don't do underwriting on this kind of loan, a mortgage loan, you inherently create something that we call adverse selection. So if you thought of running a health insurance company or life insurance company, and you weren't going to do any evaluation of your customer's health or their parents' their genetic relatives' health, you were just going to charge a high price for your insurance to compensate for the risk. Which customers would come to you? Well, obviously only the sickest. Same thing if you couldn't determine loan quality and you just charged everybody a high rate of interest as a result. Which customers would come to you? Only the worst. And so in this kind of loans, if you create adverse selection, you create, from the lender's perspective, a negative expected value of making a loan. In plain English, that means you will lose money. It's equivalent of betting against the house. And therefore, honest lenders don't engage in adverse selection. So it's a wonderful natural experiment as to which entities were clearly engaged in fraud. Entities making liar's loans were clearly engaged in fraud, mortgage lenders doing that. Okay, so we realized this as regulators in 1990 and 1991. Now, let me emphasize those dates again. 1990 and 1991. And America being America, liar's loans being a fraud, began most heavily where all financial frauds tend to develop in America, and that would be Orange County, California. Right? And we were the regional regulators for California, Arizona, and Nevada. And eventually a broader, the whole one-third of the West, one-third of the United States that's the West. So we looked at these and we said, this is insane. These liar's loans are becoming common. They must lead to fraud. In fact, they only make sense from a lender's perspective if the lender is engaged in accounting control fraud. And so we used normal supervisory means to drive them out of the savings and loan industry. The leading entity making these liar's loans also targeted minorities, particularly blacks and Latinos, families who couldn't speak English as well. Blacks because they have fewer connections and fewer choices in the financial industry. So this was a real pernicious place. It was called Long Beach Savings. And they were one of the entities we cracked down on. So Long Beach Savings Head voluntarily gave up federal deposit insurance, voluntarily gave up his charter to run a savings and loan, and became a mortgage bank for the sole purpose of escaping our regulatory jurisdiction. And as a mortgage bank, he was subject to no federal regulation in that era, other than active discrimination against minorities, right? Mm-hmm. This is not Community Reinvestment Act. This is active, I'm out, discriminating against minorities.
Right.
The truth, the fair lending laws. Now, his leading competitor is another entity run by a husband-wife team that we removed and prohibited from the savings and loan industry, the Gednax. To ease this fraud, the head of Long Beach Savings also changes the name of the organization, the now Mortgage Bank, and names it AmeriQuest. So for people who know this industry, they will now be nodding. Mm-hmm. So AmeriQuest becomes the biggest and the baddest, and it, as it's going out the door, we make this referral for discrimination. And the Justice Department follows up and finds active discrimination. So that's their second strike, right? The first strike is we went after them for the liar's loans. The second strike is the Justice Department goes after them. And, of course, they make nice, and they promise that they will approve things. And, of course, the Justice Department doesn't bring a criminal action, just a civil action, and gets a settlement. Then, of course, AmeriQuest does absolutely the same thing, targeting blacks, targeting Latinos, outright fraudulent loans, forges people's signatures, the whole 9 yards, just a completely out of control accounting control fraud, following the recipe that I talked about. And at that juncture, 49 state AGs plus the Attorney General of the District of Columbia sue them. Why not the 50th Well, because that was Virginia, and at that time, Virginia actually had some rules. And so they avoided making mortgages in Virginia. But everybody else sues them. They settle for hundreds of millions of dollars, the biggest settlement of such a kind. Again, no criminal action. Whereupon we make the head of AmeriQuest our ambassador to the Netherlands. Why? Well, because, of course, he was the leading campaign contributor to George Bush. Now, that's politics as usual. His name is Arnault. But if you want, again, the antecedents of this crisis, two entities rush to acquire AmeriQuest from our now ambassador, or our now about-to-be ambassador. Now, again, this place is absolutely notorious. It has 1,000 employees, thereabouts, who every day go in, and if they're doing substance, what they do is engage in fraud. And a particularly pernicious fraud where they look for the most vulnerable people in society to defraud. And Citicorp and Washington Mutual rush to acquire its operations. And therefore we are shocked that Citicorp and Washington Mutual made tens of billions. In the case of Washington Mutual, hundreds of billions. Actually, in the case of both of them, hundreds of billions of dollars of fraudulent loans and loan sales. So yes, that just brought us up, into the 90s and the early 2000s. So again, we knew in spades, and we not only didn't bring criminal action, we rewarded the frauds. We left them wealthy. We allowed them to sell. They were treated as respectable by the most elite financial institutions in the world, Citicorp and Washington Mutual being among them. And we bestowed our highest honors on the leading frauds. What happens next is by 2004, the FBI warns two things. One, that there is an epidemic of mortgage fraud. Epidemic was their word. And two, warns that it will produce a financial crisis being their word, if it is not checked. 2004. And here's a key thing. The FBI person in charge of the effort against mortgage fraud was interviewed by the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, the inevitable national commission to investigate the causes of this crisis. And he reported that the federal banking regulatory agencies never got in touch with him once, either before or after he made this warning about an epidemic of fraud. Now, can you imagine that? You're the federal banking regulators, the FBI, publicly, and this gets reported all over the place, trade press, general press, says epidemic of mortgage fraud is going to cause a financial crisis. And nobody in the Financial Regulatory Center says boo and follows up on it in the least. And here's a footnote also about the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. So Eric Holder, the Attorney General of the United States of America under Obama, and therefore the head of the FBI as well, in other words, the Bureau is part of the Justice Department, is called to testify in front of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. Now, what is the most famous thing the Justice Department /FBI did? Issue this warning in 2004. And Holder's the head of a huge department filled with incredibly bright people who prep him for a testimony like this so the agency looks good and so Holder looks good, right? That's your job. Prep the guy so he looks good and doesn't get embarrassed. And what is the first question have to be out of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. It's got to be, hey, what did you do in response to your own warning?
Yep.
So that is, in fact, the first question asked Holder. And Holder, at that point, and Holder is accompanied by his staff and by Lanny Brewer, the head of the criminal division.
Yep.
And his answer is, what warning? I've never heard of this. Which means nobody up there is passing a note saying, I'll take this, Eric.
Uh-huh.
There's no answer. None of them had ever heard of the warning. That's how big a priority elite financial frauds had in the incoming Obama administration.
You know, this makes my blood pressure rise just a little, and I can hear in your voice that you care very much about this too. Justice and fair play need to return to our system. I want to talk about this for a minute because it's very important, the potential corrosive impact this has on society. At a recent interview with Gretchen Morgenson, and I asked her about accountability because she's been obviously following this very closely as well, and she had this to say. She said, the idea that forging signatures, that notarizing very important legal documents really improperly in thousands of cases, maybe millions, the idea that this is somehow going to be allowed to go on with just sort of a penalty of some kind or a fine and not prosecuted in the criminal courts, I think is amazing. It really is counter to what we've all been led to believe was the course of action in such a case. You have many small people, small fry mortgage fraudsters who are in jail. I mean, we are talking about the people who were straw buyers for homes, who defrauded banks. They are in jail for a reason, because they perpetrated a fraud. These banks whose employees were forging signatures should also have been prosecuted with vigor, and they were not. They were simply allowed to negotiate their way out of trouble and negotiate their way with shareholders' money. They are not paying it out of their own executives' pockets. They are paying it out of the shareholders' pockets. There really is no accountability here whatsoever. So, in your words, why is accountability or its lack so important to each of us? Or I know some people aren't even paying attention to this particular issue. To me, it's incredibly important because I'm detecting very powerfully two sets of rules. I just did my taxes, so maybe I have a little extra ire here. Because if I don't follow the letter of the law perfectly, there's a little box on my tax document that says if I sign there and I'm signing with knowing material misrepresentations, it's a felony, right? I daily face very serious consequences of my own actions at my level, but I'm a little guy. Is that an unfair sort of summary of this, that there might be two sets of rules going on here?
Yeah, and it's what people have always warned about in crony capitalism. So there's a very conservative French economist, not long dead. The name's pronounced something in French like Bastiat, but it looks like Bastiat in terms of English spelling and pronunciation. Who said, and again I'll get pretty close to exact, when plunder becomes a way of life, a legal system becomes adopted that legalizes it, and a moral code is adopted that glorifies it. And so that's what crony capitalism, when you fully descend into it, and it's clear that the United States has descended into a version of crony capitalism. So let me tie together this accountability point and these warnings. Let me do the 2006 warnings and the reaction of the industry to both the 2004 and 2006, because that portion that you're talking about, Gretchen is talking about by far the smallest frauds that the lenders engaged in, which is at the foreclosure stage.
Mm-hmm.
But well before the foreclosure stage, you have multiple levels of massive fraud that drive the entire global crisis. So, in early 2006, the industry, the lending industries, own anti-fraud experts, a group called MARI, an acronym, M-A-R-I, issue a report that goes in writing to every member of the Mortgage Bankers Association, so thousands of entities, everybody involved. And it says, first, loans where you don't underwrite are, quote, an open invitation to fraudsters, unquote. Second, when we've studied them, the incidence of fraud is 90%, 90.
Yep.
So they're virtually all frauds. Third, these loans deserve the phrase that the industry itself uses to describe them. They are liar's loans. Fourth, you apparently have forgotten the experience of the early 90s. Remember when I was telling you about 1990, 1991? Yep. When these loans caused hundreds of millions of dollars of losses. Hundreds is even more quaint, right?
Yep.
And fifth, the federal banking regulatory agencies. Remember, this is the Bush era. Banking regulatory agencies are warning against making these kinds of loans. Okay, so you have all those warnings from the FBI. You have them from the industry's own experts. You have the fact that inherently in economics, you will lose money, that this creates adverse selection, and that no honest lender would do this. What happens? What's the industry reaction to hearing all this? Between 2003 and 2006, liar's loans expand over 500%. And this is the perfect natural experiment. You know, you may have heard these stuff, the claims that this Community Reinvestment Act or that was Fannie and Freddie, affordable housing requirements that drove the crisis. This is a favorite meme. No. Nobody ever required any lender to make or any entity to purchase a liar's loan. In fact, Fannie and Freddie were not permitted to count liar's loans towards their affordable housing goal. So the reason they did massive amounts of these loans was because of the fraud recipe. Remember, grow really rapidly by making really crappy loans, but at a premium yield. And liar's loans are perfect for that, because in the old days, the things we used to prosecute people, we had actual rules, and they were really simple rules on underwriting. In essence, you can summarize it in this brief statement. 1, before you make the loan, you have to underwrite. 2, you have to document that the borrower has the ability to repay the loan. And 3, you have to keep a written record of this underwriting. Now, if you have those 3 simple rules, which any honest lender would do if regulators never existed, right? They do all 3 of those things. So it imposes no cost on the honest portion of the industry. You can see there's a bind if you want to lie, if you want to do liar's loans, right? Because if you're going to loan to people who make really crappy loans, you're going to put in your files documentation that you knew you were making bad loans that people couldn't repay. And if you document that you knew that, your regulator is likely to say, even under the Bush administration, well then maybe you shouldn't make those loans, and maybe it's my job as a regulator to order you to stop them. Mm-hmm. Also, if you try to change the paper trail so that the regulators don't see that, if you either forge documents or destroy documents, well, that is an additional level of fraud that we can prosecute. And we can introduce it to show what your underlying intent was in making these kinds of loans. So that's really good for establishing a fraud case. But with a liar's loan, you don't have to, as the lender, document any lies on your part, right? Mm-hmm. Because you don't do any underwriting, so you don't create a paper trail that shows you knew it was a bad loan, because the definition of liar's loan is you don't verify. And so it's a perfect device for doing a fraud, right? So that's one thing that we had done. And by the way, that rule change occurred in the savings and loan industry in 1993 under the Clinton administration. And that was part of reinventing government. And I was personally there to witness this. The regulators were instructed that we were to refer to the industry and to think of the industry as our, I'm quoting, client.
Mm-hmm.
There's no more devastating mindset for ruining regulation than to define the industry you're supposed to regulate as we're supposed to serve that industry instead.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in response to these warnings, the industry massively increases liar's loans, with nobody requiring it, and indeed the federal government warning against it, even under the Bush administration. Such that by 2006, 1 out of every 3 new home loans was a liar's loan. And remember, they're 90% fraudulent. And we also know that it was overwhelmingly lenders who put the lies in the liar's loans, and did so by creating those incentive structures to make sure the mortgage bankers and the mortgage brokers would bring them loans consistent with a recipe. Incredible numbers, really crappy, and a premium yield. Okay, so back in the day, in the savings and loan crisis, as Akerlof and Romer said, the examiners in the field recognized that this was looting and fraud from the beginning. And so the re-regulation of the savings and loan industry begins in 1983. Now that's really important because the deregulation of the industry, the big acts, are 1982 and 1983. 1982 by the federal government, the Garn-St. Germain Act, and then 1983 by California, and then followed by Texas. And so what this created is what we call a regulatory race to the bottom, or economists call sometimes a competition in laxity. Who can have the weakest rules to attract the industry to come, because the industry that's committing fraud really loves weak rules. And California and Texas won, where obviously one should be in quotation marks, this race to the bottom in the savings and loan crisis. And between just those 2 states, their savings and loans produced 2/3 of total losses for the entire savings and loan debacle. Think of that. 2 states that deregulated the most produce 2/3 of the total losses.
Right? The Bush administration essentially got rid of regulation. So if nobody was looking, you were able to do this with impunity, and that's exactly what happened. Where would you look? You'd look at the specialty lenders, the lenders that did almost all of their work in the subprime and what's called Alt-A, liar's loans.
Liar's loans. Why did they call them liar's loans?
Because they were liar's loans.
And they knew it?
They knew it. They knew that they were frauds. Liar's loans mean that we don't check. You tell us what your income is, you tell us what your job is, you tell us what your assets are, and we agree to believe you. We won't check on any of those things. And by the way, you get a better deal if you inflate your income and your job history and your assets.
You think they really said that to borrowers?
We know that they said that to borrowers. In fact, they were also called in the trade ninja loans.
Ninja?
Yeah, because no income verification, no job verification, no asset verification.
You're talking about significant American companies.
Huge. One company produced as many losses as the entire savings and loan debacle.
Which company?
IndyMac, specialized in making liar's loans. In 2006 alone, it sold $80 billion of liar's loans to other companies. $80 billion.
And was this happening exclusively in this subprime mortgage business?
No, and that's a big part of the story as well. Even prime loans began to have non-verification. Even Ronald Reagan, said trust but verify.
Right.
They just gutted the verification process. We know that will produce enormous fraud under economic theory, criminology theory, and 2,000 years of life experience.
Is it possible that these complex instruments were deliberately created so swindlers could exploit them?
Oh, absolutely. This stuff, the exotic stuff that you're talking about, was created out of things like liar's loans that were known to be extraordinarily bad. And now it was getting AAA ratings. Now, a AAA rating is supposed to mean there is zero credit risk. So you take something that not only has significant, it has crushing risk. That's why it's toxic. And you create this fiction that it has zero risk. That itself, of course, is a fraudulent exercise. And again, there was nobody looking during the Bush years. So finally, only a year ago, we started to have a congressional investigation of some of these rating agencies. And it's scandalous what came out. What we know now is that the rating agencies never looked at a single loan file. When they finally did look, after the markets had completely collapsed, they found, and I'm quoting Fitch, the smallest of the rating agencies, the results were disconcerting in that there was the appearance of fraud in nearly every file we examined.
So if your assumption is correct, your evidence is sound, the bank, the lending company created a fraud, and the ratings agency that is supposed to test the value of these assets knowingly entered into the fraud. Both parties are committing fraud by intention.
Right, and the investment banker, that we call it pooling, puts together these bad mortgages, the liar's loans, and creates the toxic waste of these derivatives. All of them do that. And then they sell it to the world, and the world just thinks that because it has a AAA rating, it must actually be safe. Well, instead, there are 60 and 80% losses on these things because, of course, in reality, they are toxic waste.
You're describing what Bernie Madoff did to a limited number of people, but you're saying it's systemic, a systemic Ponzi scheme.
Oh, Bernie was a piker. He doesn't even get into the front ranks of a Ponzi scheme.
But you're saying our system became a Ponzi scheme.
Our system
Our financial system.
A Ponzi scheme. Everybody was buying a pig in the poke. But they were buying a pig in a poke with a pretty pink ribbon. And the pink ribbon said AAA.
Is there a law against liar's loan?
Not directly, but there are, of course, many laws against fraud, and liar's loans are fraudulent.
Because?
Because they're not going to be repaid and because they have false representations. They involve deceit, which is the essence of fraud.
Why is it so hard to prosecute? Why hasn't anyone been brought to justice over this?
Because they didn't even begin to investigate the major lenders until the market had actually collapsed, which is completely contrary to what we did successfully in the savings and loan crisis, right? Even while the institutions were reporting they were the most profitable savings and loan in America, we knew they were frauds and we were moving to close them down. Here, the Justice Department, even though it very appropriately warned in 2004 that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud. The FBI publicly warned in September 2004 that there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud, that if it was allowed to continue, it would produce a crisis at least as large as the savings and loan debacle, and that they were going to make sure that they didn't let that happen. So what goes wrong? First thing that goes wrong is after 9/11, the attacks, the Justice Department transfers 500 white-collar specialists in the FBI to national terrorism. And we can all understand that, but then the Bush administration refused to replace the missing 500 agents. So even today, again, as you say, this crisis is 1,000 times worse, perhaps, certainly 100 times worse than the savings and loan crisis. There are 1/5 as many FBI agents as worked the savings and loan crisis.
You talk about the Bush administration. Of course, there's that famous photograph of some of the regulators in 2003 who come to a press conference with a chainsaw suggesting that they're going to cut business loose from regulation, right?
Well, they succeeded. And in that picture, by the way, three of the other guys with pruning shears are
That's right.
They're the trade representatives. They're the lobbyists for the bankers. And everybody's grinning. The government's working together with the industry to destroy regulation. Well, we now know what happens when you destroy regulation. You get the biggest financial calamity of anybody under the age of 80.
But I can point you to statements by Larry Summers, who was then Bill Clinton's Secretary of the Treasury, or the other Clinton Secretary of the Treasury, Rubin. I can point you to suspects in both parties, right?
There were two really big things under the Clinton administration. One, they got rid of the law that came out of the real-world disasters of the Great Depression. We learned a lot of things in the Great Depression, and one is we had to separate what's called commercial banking from investment banking. That's the Glass-Steagall law. But we thought we were much smarter, supposedly, so we got rid of that law, and that was bipartisan. And the other thing is we passed a law because there was a very good regulator, Brooksley Born, that everybody should know about, probably doesn't. She tried to do the right thing to regulate one of these exotic derivatives that you're talking about. We call them CDS. And Summers, Rubin, and Phil Graham came together to say not only will we block this particular regulation, we will pass a law that says you can't regulate. And it's this type of derivative that is most involved in the AIG scandal. And AIG all by itself cost the same as the entire savings and loan debacle.
What did AIG contribute? What did they do wrong?
They made bad loans. Their type of loan was to sell a guarantee, right? And they charged a lot of fees up front, so they booked a lot of income, paid enormous bonuses. The bonuses we're thinking about now, they're much smaller than these bonuses that were also the product of accounting fraud. And they got very, very rich. But of course, then they had guaranteed this toxic waste, these liar's loans. Well, we've just gone through why those toxic waste, those liar's loans, are going to have enormous losses. And so you have to pay the guarantee on those enormous losses, and you go bankrupt. Except that you don't in the modern world, because you come to the United States and the taxpayers play the fool under Secretary Geithner and under Secretary Paulson before him. We took $5 billion, for example, in U.S. taxpayer money and sent it to a huge Swiss bank called UBS at the same time that that bank was defrauding the taxpayers of America. And we were bringing a criminal case against them. We eventually get them to pay a $780 million fine, but wait, we gave them $5 billion. So the taxpayers of America paid the fine of a Swiss bank. And why are we bailing out somebody that is defrauding us?
And why?
How mad is this?
What is your explanation for why the bankers who created this mess are still calling the shots?
Well, that, especially after what's just happened at GM, it's scandalous.
Why are they firing the president of GM and not firing the head of all these banks that are involved?
There are two reasons. One, they're much closer to the bankers. These are people from the banking industry, and they have a lot more sympathy. In fact, they're outright hostile to auto workers, as you can see. They want to bash all of their contracts, but when they get to banking, they say, oh, contracts, sacred. But the other element of your question is, we don't want to change the bankers, because if we do, if we put honest people in who didn't cause the problem, their first job would be to find the scope of the problem. And that would destroy the cover-up. And the cover-up is... Sure, the cover-up.
It's a serious charge.
Of course.
Who's covering up?
Geithner is covering up, just like Paulson did before him. Geithner is publicly saying that it's going to take $2 trillion. A trillion is 1,000 billion. Right? $2 trillion taxpayer dollars to deal with this problem. But they're allowing all the banks to report that they're not only solvent, but fully capitalized. Both statements can't be true. It can't be that they need $2 trillion because they have massive losses and that they're fine. These are all people who have failed. Paulson failed, Geithner failed. They were all promoted because they failed, not because they had succeeded. Well, Geithner was one of our nation's top regulators during the entire subprime scandal that I've just described. He took absolutely no effective action. He gave no warning. He did nothing in response to the FBI warning that there was an epidemic of fraud. All this pig in the poke stuff happened under him. So in his phrase about legacy assets, well, he's a failed legacy regulator.
Are you saying that Timothy Geithner, the Secretary of the Treasury, and others in the administration with the banks are engaged in a cover-up to keep us from knowing what went wrong? And
Absolutely.
You are?
Absolutely. Because they are scared to death. All right? They're scared to death of a collapse. They're afraid that if they admit the truth that many of the large banks are insolvent, they think Americans are a bunch of cowards and they will run and screaming to the exits, and we won't rely on deposit insurance. And by the way, you can rely on deposit insurance. And it's foolishness. All right? Now, it may be worse than that. You can impute more cynical motives, but I think they are sincerely just panicked about we just can't let big banks fail. That's wrong.
But what might happen at this point if, in fact, they keep from us the true health of the banks?
Well, then the banks will, as they did in Japan, either stay enormously weak or the Treasury will be forced to increasingly absurd giveaways of taxpayer money. We've seen how horrific AIG, right? And remember, they kept secret from everyone what
AIG
they were doing with, no, Treasury. And both administrations, the Bush administration and now the Obama administration, kept secret from us what was being done with AIG. AIG was being used secretly to bail out favored banks like UBS and like Goldman Sachs, Secretary Paulson's firm that he had come from being CEO. It got the largest amount of money, $12.9 billion, and they didn't want us to know that. And it was only congressional pressure, and not congressional pressure, by the way, on Geithner, but congressional pressure on AIG, where Congress said, we will not give you a single penny more unless we know who received the money. And you know, when he was Treasury Secretary, Paulson created a recommendation group to tell Treasury what they ought to do with AIG, and he put Goldman Sachs on it.
Even though Goldman Sachs had a big vested stake.
Massive stake, and even though he had just been CEO of Goldman Sachs before becoming Treasury Secretary. Now, in most stages in American history, that would be a scandal of such proportions that he wouldn't be allowed in civilized society.
Yeah, like a conflict of interest, it seems.
Massive conflict
So how did
of
they get
interest.
away with it?
I don't know whether we've lost our capability of outrage or whether the cover-up has been so successful that people just don't have the facts to react to it.
Who's going to get the facts?
We need some chairmen or chairwomen in Congress to hold the necessary hearings, and we can blast this out. But if you leave the failed CEOs in place, it isn't just that they're terrible business people, though they are, and it isn't just that they lack integrity, though they do, because they were engaged in these frauds, but they're not going to disclose the truth about the assets.
And we have to know that in order to know what?
To know everything, to know who committed the frauds, whose bonuses we should recover, how much the assets are worth, how much they should be sold for, is the bank insolvent such that we should resolve it in this way. It's the predicate, right? You need to know the facts to make intelligent decisions, and they're deliberately leaving in place the people that cause the problem because they don't want the facts. And this is not new. The Reagan administration's central priority at all times during the savings and loan crisis was covering up the losses.
So you're saying that people in power, political power and financial power, act in concert when their own behinds are in the ringer, right?
That's right. And it's particularly a crisis that brings this out, because then the class of the banker says, you've got to keep the information away from the public or everything will collapse. Right? If they understand how bad it is, they'll run for the exits.
Yeah, this week in New York at this conference, you described this as more than a financial crisis. You called it a moral crisis.
Yes.
Why?
Because it is a fundamental lack of integrity, but also because if you look back at crises, an economist who was also a presidential appointee as a regulator in the savings and loan industry, right here in New York. Larry White wrote a book about the savings and loan crisis, and he said, you know, one of the most interesting questions is why so few people engaged in fraud? Because objectively, you could have gotten away with it. But only about 10% of the CEOs engaged in fraud. So 90% of them were restrained by ethics and integrity. So far more than law or by FBI agents, it's our integrity that often prevents the greatest abuses. And what we had in this crisis, instead of the savings and loan, is the most elite institutions in America engaging or facilitating fraud.
This wound that you say has been inflicted on American life, the loss of workers' income and security and pensions and future, happened because of the misconduct of a relatively few very well-heeled people in very well-decorated corporate suites, right?
Right.
It was relatively a handful of people.
And their ideologies, which swept away regulation. So, in the example, regulation means that cheaters don't prosper. So instead of being bad for capitalism, it's what saves capitalism. Honest purveyors prosper is what we want, and you need regulation and law enforcement to be able to do this. The tragedy of this crisis is it didn't need to happen at all.
When you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about your work, what do you make of that? What do you tell yourself?
There's a saying that we took great comfort in. It's actually by the Dutch, who were fighting this impossible war for independence against what was then the most powerful nation in the world, Spain. And their motto was, it is not necessary to hope in order to persevere. Now, going forward, get rid of the people that have caused the problems. That's a pretty straightforward thing as well. Why would we keep CEOs and CFOs and other senior officers that had caused the problems? That's facially nuts. That's our current system. So stop that, the current system. We're hiding the losses instead of trying to find out the real losses. Stop that, because you need good information to make good decisions. All right? Follow what works instead of what's failed. Start appointing people who have records of success instead of records of failure. That would be another nice place to start. There are lots of things we can do. Even today, as late as it is, even though they've had a terrible start to the administration, they could change, and they could change within weeks. And by the way, the folks who are the better regulators, they paid their taxes, so you can get them through the vetting process a lot quicker.
William Black, thank you very much for being with me on The Journal.
Thank you so much.
So what would you do that would create more jobs?
I would have an employer of last resort program. It is incredibly stupid to have a system in which you pay people who want to work and are able to work not to work, instead of paying them to do constructive work. That's good for them, it's good for society and such. And we are locked in this utter greatest waste you can imagine, which is throwing people on the scrap heap who want to work. We now have 26 million Americans who want to work full-time who can't. We have 46 million Americans in poverty. We have more than 20% of all children in America are in poverty at the current time. Those are all obscenities. And in our system, that translates to all kinds of terrible educational, health outcomes, life expectancy, everything you want to mention. So use the government through the nonprofits and NGOs as the employer of last resort. This is a system that worked brilliantly in the Great Depression, and it should be a regular feature of all governments. You should end wasteful unemployment. It is quite correct that you're not going to get private sector jobs because private sector demand has collapsed. And of course it has, because we're in a great recession. That's the whole point of why you cannot do it through the private sector alone. That's why you have the government do it. And in the modern era, unlike the WPA era, we can leverage all of these nonprofits and NGOs that already exist, so that we don't need a single massive federal program. We can have a federal overall program of funding, and we can do productive things through the actually hundreds of thousands of NGOs and nonprofits that exist out there. So we're particularly lucky in the United States to have such a vast network, and we could do it quicker.
No, my point wasn't you couldn't do it. My point is that the pressure coming from the private sector, especially some of the bigger companies, on the politicians and on Congress, is they don't want this to happen because they're taking advantage of this situation to lower wages.
Well, but you see, it's really bad for them as well in terms of overall profitability. If more people have incomes, then they buy more things and business does better as well. I don't disagree with you that the Koch brothers of the world are, semi-suicidal in their approach to life. They are destroying America in the process. And as you gut first the middle class and the working classes, you ultimately gut even the professional classes above them. And that's just nuts. We want demand to improve, and the best way to get demand to improve is by having people work, and they aren't and won't do it at anything like an appropriate rate under the present system, because private sector demand is completely inadequate to pay for it. So we are doing the opposite. We are going through our states and localities at a time when teachers have never been more necessary, police officers have never been more necessary, firefighters, etc., and firing those people and losing all of their skills and experience. That's just crazy. Remember, every government comes in and saying it's going to stop fraud, waste, and abuse. Well, there is no greater waste than taking 26 million Americans who want to work full-time and saying, no, actually, even though it's going to make the recession worse, even though it'll make the overall economy worse, even though it'll make your lives worse on every psychological dimension, we will not give you jobs. We will pay you instead to stay home and watch television.
Right.
That's crazy talk.
Okay, go to point two.
Point two, stop the foreclosures. We have over 12 million Americans whose mortgages are seriously underwater. I mean, severely underwater. In other words, their loan is more than 125% of the true value of their house, which is to say they owe a lot more in debt in the mortgage than their house is worth. So we have a good 12 or more million Americans at serious risk of losing their homes. If they do, if any significant portion of them lose their homes, then we guarantee that we go back into recession. We guarantee that we create a massive increase in poverty and unemployment and healthcare crisis, because the folks will be made homeless in these circumstances. This is self-destructive again. It's bad for industry. It's bad for people of all classes, and we need to stop it. The way to stop it is, the existing programs cannot work precisely because those figures I gave you. Overwhelmingly, people were put into houses that weren't worth anywhere near as much as they paid for them. And the most common reason this occurred was through fraud in the inducement. So what you need, stop the foreclosures, reduce the principal where that will actually allow, with the person's income, them to repay, which is a win-win for the lender and for them. And in situations where it's just absurd, you can't reduce the principal in any reasonable amount so that they can continue to pay, Then there are folks like Dean Baker who have innovative programs for renting, converting from ownership to a rental where you can't possibly afford the place. But that will keep these properties from deteriorating and being destroyed, and that's exactly what's happening.
Bill, this concept of odious debt that exists at the state level and in common law and British and U.S. law, if I understand it correctly, it has to do with if a lender lends money to someone that, one, they know they could never repay, and in the final analysis won't go to the benefit of that person, that odious debt is considered something that doesn't have to be repaid. I mean, is there enough of a tradition here in the United States that could be fought on, and would it apply in this situation?
Only in a few states, and it would be very difficult, and the people that would most need it won't have lawyers. So no is the short answer.
So it needs a straightforward law to freeze foreclosures, is what you're saying.
It does need a straightforward law, and it's going to need actions, not by individual, but by the government overall, that says places like Washington Mutual, places like Countrywide, were engaged in endemic fraud in which they induced homeowners into these situations, typically by dramatically inflating the appraisal. So in the case of Washington Mutual, for example, then Attorney General of New York Cuomo, now Governor Cuomo, investigation found that WAMU had a blacklist of appraisers. But you got on the blacklist if you refused to inflate the appraisal. Step back for a second. Would an honest lender ever inflate an appraisal? Because that's their great protection against loss. And the answer is no. So we have good information on the fact that there was endemic appraisal fraud. Borrowers can't do that. That comes from lenders and their agents. So we have massive cases of borrowers being induced by fraud to take out those loans.
So that leads to point 3.
That leads to point 3. But it also leads to point 2. That provides a basis for foreclosure relief. In fact, that gets you out of the mortgage debt potentially entirely, and you could just put the house back to them with no ability for them to have a deficiency judgment against you. The third thing is the banksters, and here it is obscene. So again, the contrast to the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loan crisis, our agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, makes well over 10,000 criminal referrals. We work with the FBI to prioritize the absolutely worst, most elite criminals. We prosecute them. We have a 90% success rate against the best criminal defense lawyers in the world. And we get over 1,000 felony convictions in these prioritized ultra elite cases. Flash forward to the current crisis. The same agency, the Office of Thrift Supervision, makes 0 criminal referrals. Produces, of course, 0 cases, because these complex cases can only be brought if the regulators, who have to serve as the regulatory cops on the beat, make the case for the FBI and the Justice Department and point them towards the most elite criminals. This crisis, the losses just to homeowners are 11 trillion. That's with a T. A trillion is 1,000 billion. 11 trillion losses. The savings and loan crisis, which was widely described at the time as the worst financial scandal in U.S. history, was $150 billion. In other words, in terms of just this subset of losses, this crisis is 70 times larger. And we have, count them, 10 corporate insiders who have been convicted of fraud, all from a single case. None of them remotely elite Wall Street types.
Right, so to sum up,
savings and loan crisis, 1,000 FBI agents. This crisis, as recently as 2007, 120 FBI agents, all of them looking at little people instead of big people. So to sum it up, Holder needs to be fired. We need to completely reorient the FBI to investigate the elite frauds. Geithner, who is pushing to try to get immunity for the criminals, needs to be fired 3 years ago, replaced with someone who will protect Americans, protect the 99 instead of the 1%. We can make the effective prosecutions, but we need new leaders, and we need many more FBI agents working the cases, and they have to be reoriented to going after the elite criminals.
So here are some numbers. Credit Suisse says that by 2006, 49% of all mortgage originations in the United States were liar's loans. The lowest incidence of fraud when we study liar's loans is 50%, and that's when the fraudsters study themselves. When independent folks study it, it's in the 80 to 90% fraud range. That means there were millions of acts of fraud. Those loan frauds occur not because there's some clever person making $20,000 a year who is able to deceive the banks, but because the banks created incentive structures for the loan brokers to bring them the absolute worst of the worst loans and to lie on the application forms to hit the magic ratios on loan to value and things like that that a homeowner wouldn't have even known what number to put in. So these frauds came from the banks, and they propagated through the system through a series of what we call echo epidemics, in which they got appraisers first to give them grossly inflated values, and there are excellent numbers on that, to give outside auditors to give them clean opinions on ludicrous financial statements. Every single time they were able to get a clean opinion, and every single time virtually they were able to get a AAA rating out of the credit rating agencies. So this fraud did in fact spread through the system, and that's why we have a crisis in foreclosures now. This is not a random, unrelated fraud. This stems from the underlying fraud by the lenders in mortgage loans to the tune of well over 1 million cases a year.
To be specific here, Countrywide is no longer around, right? We've seen Angelo Mozilo. He's sort of paying the price. Perhaps you don't think he's paying a big enough price, but Countrywide was not the only underwriter and servicer of mortgages. We have Citigroup, we have JP Morgan Chase, we have Bank of America was a separate entity at the time. So who specifically is currently still in there underwriting mortgages that you think should be paying a bigger price?
Well, first, Mozilo didn't pay a price. He made a profit through fraud. So, you know, he made hundreds of millions of dollars of fraud. If that's paying a price, then we're encouraging this going forward. The major frauds continue at Citicorp, for example. Citicorp, its top credit guy testified under oath that 80% of the mortgage loans it sold to Fannie and Freddie were sold under false reps and warranties. And he warned Rubin, among others, in writing of this, and the percentage fraud actually increased after the warnings, and of course they fired him rather than clean up the problem.
William Black is going to be on one of the key panels this morning here at the conference. He's a professor of economics and law at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. He was the director of the Institute for Fraud Prevention, litigation director at the Federal Home Loan Bank Boards. Basically, Bill Black is a man who has followed bank regulation and bank fraud in the front lines for many, many years. Bill, welcome.
Thank you.
Since JP Morgan has just reported and actually, beating the estimates, even though their earnings fell, what do you make of their earnings report and what it says about JP Morgan and the banks more broadly?
We can't really trust any earnings reports we get since they changed the accounting rules about 2 weeks ago, so that management now can give values to assets that it thinks they should have. Well, of course, they think they should have very high values.
Well, when you look at something like their the credit card losses and the default rates, is this the kind of problem that a bank like JP Morgan sort of can take in stride? or not? And more broadly, what does it mean for all the banks? Because everyone faces this now.
No, their defaults on their credit card portfolio are up very substantially. That's very bad news going forward, not just for them, but for all similar situated competitors are going to be experiencing that. It's going to be a lagged effect. As people lose income and jobs, they're going to start defaulting on credit cards more.
What about bank reserves then?
Well, bank reserves are grotesquely too small. So that's where the real games are being played, is that they're not reserving for the losses. And that's what the accounting rules were just changed to facilitate exactly that kind of lying to the public.
Ooh, well, what about the stress test? Isn't that what they're going to test for? Do they have enough reserves relative to a weakened economy?
Well, the stress test doesn't test for reserves at all, because it doesn't test for asset quality at all or for losses at all. It's a farce in truth. I've called it a sham in print, and that's what it's going to be. And you see that, of course, at least the leaks are that everybody passed the stress test, even though there's supposedly a $2 trillion hole, according to Treasury Secretary Geithner. Well, how can the banks all pass the stress test if they collectively need $2 trillion in U.S. taxpayer money?
But isn't the idea that before we get the results, that the Treasury, someone's going to announce that the weakest banks, they're going to do preemptive capital injections, maybe even arrange some preemptive mergers?
Well, if they arranged mergers that actually strengthen banks without making even bigger banks, because we've seen that the bigger the bank, the worse the problem, that would be a good thing. If they're going to put capital in, well, that's a violation of the law. We have a law, the Prompt Corrective Action Law, that says you're not supposed to be doing anything like that. And the prior administration violated that law, and the current administration is violating that law. That's terrible policy, and of course, it's not very good to violate the law.
What's the next step here? What's the next big shoe to drop?
Well, commercial loans are already dropping, so I think that commercial real estate is going to be a world of hurt. That's going to flow through not just into banks, but to many insurance companies which hold commercial real estate. As you can see, credit cards are already hitting as well.
And now we'll hear from Mr. William K. Black, Associate Professor of Economics and Law, the University of Missouri, Kansas City School of Law. Mr. Black.
Committee, thank you. You asked earlier for a stern regulator. You have one now in front of you. And we need to be blunt. And you haven't heard much bluntness in hours of testimony. We stopped a non-prime crisis before it became a crisis in 1991 by supervisory actions. We did it so effectively that people have forgotten it even existed, even though it caused several $100 million in losses, but none to the taxpayers. We did it by preemptive litigation and by supervision. We broke a raging epidemic of accounting control fraud without new legislation in the period 1984 through 1986. Legislation would have been helpful. We sought legislation, but we didn't get it. And we were able to stop that because we didn't simply continue business as usual. Lehman's failure is a story in large part of fraud. And it is fraud that begins at the absolute latest in 2001. And that is with their subprime and their liar's loan operation. Lehman was the leading purveyor of liar's loans in the world for most of this decade. Studies on liar's loans show incidence of fraud of 90%. Lehman sold this to the world with reps and warranties that there were no such frauds. If you want to know why we have a global crisis, in large part, it is before you, but it hasn't been discussed today, amazingly. Financial institution leaders are not engaged in risk when they engage in liar's loans. Liar's loans will cause a failure. They lose money. The only way to make money is to deceive others by selling bad paper, and that will eventually lead to liability and failure as well. When people cheat, you cannot, as a regulator, continue business as usual. They go into a different category, and you must act completely differently as a regulator. When we've gotten and said sad excuses, the SEC, we're told there are only 24 people in their comprehensive program. Who decided how many people there would be in their comprehensive program? Who decided the staffing? The SEC did. To say that we only had 24 people is not to create an excuse, it's to give an admission of criminal negligence, except it's not criminal because you're a federal employee. In the context of the FDIC, Secretary Geithner testified today that this event pushed the financial system to the brink of collapse. But Chairman Bernanke testified we sent 2 people to be on site at Lehman. We sent 50 credit people to the largest savings and loan in America. It had $30 billion in assets. We had a whole lot less staff than the Fed does. We forced out the CEO. We replaced the CEO, and we did that not through regulation, but because of our leverage as creditors. Now, I ask you, who had more leverage as creditors in 2008? The Fed compared to the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco 19 years earlier? Incomprehensible greater leverage in the Fed, and it simply was not used. And we've heard it. So let's start with the repos. We have known since Enron in 2001 that this is a common scam in which every major bank that was approached by Enron agreed to help them deceive creditors and investors by doing these kind of transactions. And so what happened? There was a proposal in 2004 to stop it. And the regulatory heads, it was an interagency effort, killed it. They came out with something pathetic in 2006 and stalled its implementation to 2007, but it's meaningless. We have known for a decade that these are frauds. We have known for a decade how to stop them. All of the major regulatory agencies were complicit in that statement in destroying it. We have a self-fulfilling policy of regulatory failure because of the leadership in this era. We have the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, finding that this is three-card Monte. Well, what would you do as a regulator if you knew that one of the largest enterprises in the world, when the nation is on the brink of collapse, economic collapse, is engaged in fraud, three-card Monte? Would you continue business as usual? That's what was done. Oh, they met a lot. They say that we only had a nuclear stick. Sounds pretty good stick to use if you're on the brink of collapse of the system. But that's not what the Fed has to do. The Fed is a central bank. Central banks for centuries have gotten rid of the heads of financial institutions. The Bank of England does it with a luncheon. The board of directors are invited. They don't say no. They are sat down. The head of the Bank of England says, "We have lost confidence in the CEO of your enterprise. We believe that Mr. Jones would be an effective replacement." And by 4 o'clock that day, Mr. Jones is running the place. And he has a mandate to clean up all the problems. Instead, every day that Lehman remained under its leadership, the exposure of the American people to loss grew by hundreds of millions of dollars on average. Aurora was pumping out up to $3 billion a month in liar's loans. Losses on those are running roughly 50% to 85 cents on the dollar. It is critical not to do business as usual, to change. We've also heard from Secretary Geithner and Chairman Bernanke, we couldn't deal with these lenders because we had no authority over them. The Fed had unique authority since 1994 under HOEPA to regulate all mortgage lenders. It finally used it in 2008. They could have stopped Aurora. They could have stopped the subprime unit of Lehman that was really a liar's loan place as well as time went by. Thank you very much.